Okay, well, today we are pleased to have with us Patrick Gray, who is Professor of Religious Studies at Rhodes College. Patrick's been taught us several times before, but just to refresh our memories, he is received his PhD in religion from Emory University, and he taught at Emory and Okafor in the Atlanta area, as well as in Japan. And his research focuses on the Greco-Roman context of early Christianity and the history of biblical interpretation. And in 2013, he was awarded the Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Research and Creative Activity. Patrick has a long list of publications, which I will not read, but his most recent is Hebrews, which was co-authored with Amy Peter and was published in 2020. And then in 2021, he served as editor of the Cambridge Companion to the New Testament, Cambridge University Press. So today, Patrick's going to share with us a lesson on familiar yet strange, which is the story of Moses at Mount Sinai. But before we do that, let's pray. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Holy God, we are grateful this morning for this opportunity to gather and to learn from your word. We ask that you grant us open and receptive minds and hearts as we study together, and may what we learn today bear fruit in our lives to your greater glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, thank you.
So, well, thank you for cussing while
So is this the microphone?
Yeah.
Oh, I was standing over there the whole time. I thought it was like heating up water. I thought it was a thermos. Okay. Gotcha. All right, so
I wouldn't drink it.
don't drink the water.
It'll
So
follow you.
It'll follow me, so I
Yeah.
can move a little bit. And,
Yeah.
All right. So I can't see how many. I don't. How many people are watching from home here on Zoom?
We've got 10.
About 10, okay. So about 10 here, so just so I can kind of have that in mind. And so thanks, it's good to be here. I was ready to be here. I was kind of ready to be here last week, but I didn't have power back until Friday morning. So I was out of power for 8 days. So I was kind of not all that upset when late Saturday night you said they called it off at the building. So when did you guys get power back here in this building?
Monday.
Yeah. So, yeah, lots of people are still obviously dealing with a lot of difficulties here. Fewer though, which is good. So I couldn't even have Zoom from home, so I was going to my office, but they lost power for a while too. But we're good. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today is a scene that's kind of familiar. I mean, it's one of the most famous scenes in the Bible, actually, Moses at Sinai. And let me just start. So when you think of Sinai, I'm not looking for anything in particular, but I think I know a few things you'll say. But what are the whole Sinai episode? When you think of that, what do you think of? Who do you think of? What do you think of? Charlton Heston, yeah, it was 1956. I can't remember. Yeah, I mean that is the white. He's there. He goes up and he's like all like really white haired, right? After he comes down from the mountain, right? So Charlton Heston, the kind of iconic scenes in the 10 Commandments, right? Cecil B. DeMille. What other episodes? So that figure, I mean, that's probably an indelible image, right? What other kind of incidents, episodes? I don't know. Anything else?
I think the peninsula.
Huh?
I think the peninsula, Sinai Peninsula.
Okay.
Of course, it's not.
Right, yeah, that kind of triangular notch there between Egypt and Israel, right? So the Sinai, right? Yeah.
The war between Egypt and Israel.
That's what I think.
That's interesting that name kind of conjures much more kind of contemporary kind of incidents than maybe ancient, but yeah, other kinds of things. What happens there? I mean, kind of like the two big incidents, I guess, in biblical Sinai, right? Is the 10 Commandments, the giving of the law, and then probably the golden calf episode. And I'm not going to talk about either one of those, even though, or maybe just a tiny little bit. Speaking of the location, though, so it's a mountain, Mount Sinai. When you look at maps, You know, a lot of Bibles have maps at the back, and this one does. A lot of them try to kind of reconstruct the wanderings of the Israelites through the Sinai, through the wilderness of Sinai. You'll see dotted lines and kind of solid lines because it's really hard to tell based on the kind of clues you get in the biblical text. You also will have kind of multiple locations for Mount Sinai, one in the north, one in the south, because I don't think it's just for like kind of tourist reasons. Everybody wants to be the side of Sinai, but it's a little unclear, and names change, right, over time. And borders change. So one of the difficulties in just even kind of saying where the Sinai is, you have the whole peninsula, which is really small, and then there's a mountain. One of the difficulties in trying to say, when did they leave Egypt, is because the borders of Egypt change over time. Like, think about it. If we were to go back to the year 1800 and we were sitting right where we are right now, and I said, how far would you have to go to leave the United States from right in this spot we're standing? What, like 5 minutes maybe, right? Because that's just before the Louisiana Purchase, and the borders of the United States change dramatically, right? So, and also if I asked you, did anybody graduate from Rhodes? Usually I have somebody in this class who graduated from Rhodes, but none of you graduated from Rhodes because it wasn't Rhodes until 1983, 84, something like that. So Southwest. So yes and no. My point there is that when it comes to the Israelites leaving Egypt, well, at one point in time when the Israelites, whenever that was, were in Egypt, and at another time when this story is being told, the borders may have been much smaller, or they may have been up here almost close to like present day Israel. So what constituted leaving Israel is really, really kind of fuzzy, right? So those maps, it's like, well, we think maybe here, may think maybe there, but all these names change over time. And so we're really, really uncertain. So a little bit of a preface there. Sinai, of course, is where Moses gets the law, and that's the most consequential part of that episode. But it wasn't just hey, we've got the law now. I want to back up to, if you have your Bible, turn to Exodus chapter 11. We're going to look at one passage very briefly that helps us understand why they're going to Sinai and what's really going to happen there. And then we're going to look at something in Exodus chapter 19 for a while, and then we're going to skip over the 10 Commandments and look at some other things in our brief time we have here today. But in chapter 11, this is before they leave Egypt, but they're about to leave Egypt, and there have been a series of plagues, and God is about to tell Moses about this last plague. And the last plague is what? The big one, right? Yeah, the death of the firstborn in all the land, from Pharaoh's house all the way down to like even the slaves and even the animals, firstborn of the animals. But look at chapter 11. So chapter 11, the Lord says to Moses, here's what I'm going to do. Tell the people this. And then it go down to verse 4, where then Moses is repeating what God, so God has said to Moses, tell the people this. And so it appears as though he's talking to the people, though by the end of this chapter, it looks like he's also been talking to the Pharaoh. So the audience is a little unclear, but what I want to focus on is Moses is telling the people and the Pharaoh, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be this plague, the last plague. It's going to be a biggie. And, the firstborn is going to die. That starts in verse 4. And then he says, there's going to be a loud cry, verse 6, throughout the whole land of Egypt, such as never been or ever will be again. Not a dog's going to growl at any of the Israelites, not at people, not at animals. And then here's the key thing. So that you may know the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. This is, so that is a clear purpose statement. So that you may know. Now, what's the subtext? I mean, what's kind of like logically implied here? If he is saying, I am doing this so that you may know there's a distinction, what he's saying is that they don't know, right? I mean, otherwise, he says, my purpose is so that you may know. So that's a little bit strange to think. If he says, I'm doing this so that you'll know, he must think that the Egyptians and or the Israelites are not aware, do not know that there's a distinction, that God makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. You say, well, surely they know that there's a distinction. Apparently not, because he's going to some great lengths to make this point, killing all the firstborn in the land. So it is very, very important in God's mind here that you know there's a distinction between you Egyptians and you Israelites, and I'm going to like kill the firstborn all the land so that you know this. And so you might think, how would you know an Egyptian from? Do you know an Egyptian when you see one? Do you know an Israelite when you see one? How would you tell the difference? Or do they look the same? Do they look different? I mean, any kind of, within any kind of ethnic group, we all kind of see our diversity and our differences, but every ethnic group, the outside, from the outside, they all look the same, right? So it's hard to know what their physical appearance may or may not have told them. I mean, the only real difference you can think of is, the Israelites would have been slaves, and the Egyptians would not have been slaves. Otherwise, what is the difference, Are there any, kind of jumping ahead, you may be familiar with this story, I'm sure you are with a lot of it. Are there any indications that the Israelites themselves kind of don't see themselves as much different from the Egyptians? Remember when they get out of Egypt, they pass through the Red Sea. Do you remember what happens right when they kind of like go over on the other side? They're out of Egypt. What do they start doing? Oh, well, the water comes down and kills all the people who've been chasing them. Yeah, and then after that, they're kind of like in the desert, right? We're free, but we're in the desert. They happy about that? No, because it's a desert, right? and they say, were there not enough graves back in Egypt that you had to bring us out here to die? So as soon as they get out, they want to go home. And where's home? Egypt. They think of Egypt as home. And we go a little further ahead after the 10 Commandments. And while Moses is up there getting the 10 Commandments, what are the rest of the Israelites doing down in the valley?
Asking Aaron to make another god for them.
That's right. Got to build it. And it's funny when Moses does come down and he's like, what is going on here? And Moses is like, I don't know. They just, and you read it, it literally says this. They just gave me all this gold and I put it in the fire and out came this calf. Like, it just kind of like created itself or something like that. But yeah, so what do? They build a golden calf. Now, where do you think they got the idea to build a golden calf and worship it? That sounds a little bit like
Hathor, the Egyptian god.
Oh, okay. It sounds Egyptian, right? Yeah, I mean, we may not be Egyptologists here, but you're pretty, it's pretty well known, the Egyptian propensity for like kind of worshiping God, in the form of cats and, other kinds of animals. That tendency it's not exclusively Egyptian, but so this idea of building an idol of an animal and worshiping it sounds pretty Egyptian to me. So you have a number of things where the Israelites are not very distinguishable from the Egyptians, right? And why might that be? Well, again, thinking about the context of the whole story, how long have they been in Egypt? A long time. In fact, in the kind of narrative that establishes the Passover ritual, it says, on that night, it was 430 years ago that night that they first entered the land. So you have a people, the Israelites, who have been in Egypt for 4 centuries. Now, some of us, probably most of us were born in the United States. Most of us, our people, our ancestors came from somewhere else, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300. I mean, when you have been away from whatever your home is for 430 years, unless you make a really intentional, sustained effort, you do not retain that culture, right? I mean, it doesn't usually take 400 years to assimilate into a new culture. So have the Israelites been doing that? I mean, in a sense, they're already God's people, right? I mean, going back to Genesis 12 and the story of Abraham, they're in a sense already God's people. They kind of forgot that. Forgotten it to the point where God says, I need to remind you that I make a distinction between you and everybody else. And this is what I'm going to do to it. So, but it's understandable. 400 years, they're more or less Egyptian, right? So that is what he's going to kind of a point he's going to drive home in chapter 19. If you go to chapter 19 in Exodus, they are at Sinai. And they're up on this mountain. Now, in some rabbinic discussions, they note that there's no clear indication of where Sinai is. In some rabbinic discussions, among ancient rabbis, the Talmud, they say they left that out on purpose. They intentionally didn't want people to know exactly where it was, or they would make it into kind of a shrine and they would want to stay there rather than continuing their journey on to the promised land, building a temple and all that. So anyway, there's a lot of discussion among ancient Jewish writers about, why don't we know exactly where that was? But here they are at Sinai, and it's thundering and lightning and smoky, which might make you think of another scene earlier in Exodus, also on a mountain with fire and smoke and an encounter with God. It might make you think of Exodus chapter 3, which is where Moses first has this encounter with the burning bush, right? So that's on Mount Horeb. And it seems in different tellings and retellings of these stories that Horeb and Sinai may be like two different names for the same mountain. So if that's the case, then what we have in Exodus 3, we have Moses privately having this encounter with God, where God manifests himself in form of burning bush. So privately, what we have in chapter 19 here, we're going to look at verses 3 through 6 in some detail. What we have is God manifesting himself to the whole people, not privately to Moses, but to the whole people, also on the same mountain, though under a different name. This is the only place, in fact, where God is going to speak to the entire people of Israel right there in this one scene. So in chapter 19, they're gathered at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses meets with God, and God says, here's what I want you to tell the people. And it's kind of a proposal. In a sense, they're already his people, but they have to kind of, renew their vows or something. I don't want to kind of, mix metaphors or strain a metaphor here, but he says, here's what I want you to tell them, and get their response. See if they want to kind of be my people. He's not going to kind of force them into this. But look at chapter 19, verses 3 through 6 here at Sinai. It says, then Moses went up to God. The Lord called him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites. Okay, here's what I want you to tell them, Moses. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. This very short passage where God says, here, Moses say this, it's very dense. It's chock full of a meaning in terms of what does it mean to be God's people? What is he calling them to do? What is he asking them to do? What is going to be involved in this, the relationship and the status as being God's people? And we can kind of pick it apart line by line. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings. What is that? What kind of an image is that? What does that do for you? Is there any kind of subtext there? You've seen what I've done to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings. What does that image do for you? Yes, kind of mother bird, kind of swooping in, right? Kind of rescuing you, carrying you away, right? So it's a kind of a nurturing image, I guess, There are kinds of responses to that kind of imagery. Again, he could have used any number of different animals, I suppose, any kind of metaphors. You can see it's very comforting, right? Other ways to see it. You've seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings. Now, what did he just do to the Egyptians? He just killed a lot of them. And I mean, I guess if I'm like a baby what's a baby eagle? An eaglet? I don't know. If I'm a baby bird, the image of mama bird coming in and, kind of swooping me away is very comforting. What if you're a squirrel? The image of an eagle, not such a comfort, like, an eagle is a predator, right? So this could be kind of a multivalent kind of image. It could be very comforting if you're in the right relationship with this eagle, but if you're not, then this is like very threatening. And he kind of hints at that, right? By you've seen what I did to the Egyptians, right? I just killed a lot. So, right, yeah. Kind of soaring, and you kind of have a different kind of perspective, right? Very good, yeah. So I've seen what I've done, how bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all peoples. A lot there. All right, so this is, so they're like renewing the covenant. Now, the covenant, what are some synonyms in English for covenant? What's a covenant? Contract, promise, maybe a treaty. The term in the same term, berit, in ancient sources, kind of like a treaty between different nations. You have pact or something like that. All these are related, different kind of connotations. Maybe you think of kind of a contract. And in some ways, it's like a contract. In many ways, it's not like a contract. because you've all kind of signed leases or contracts. Think about the language you find in a contract and the language you find here. In kind of rental or purchase agreements, you get a lot of third person language, right? The buyer, the renter, the seller, this sort of thing. Here, though, you get what kind of pronouns you get. How you've seen how I bore you on eagle's wings. I brought you to myself. If you obey my voice, you shall be my treasured possession. A lot of first and second person pronouns. I, me. You don't see that in kind of like the kind of impersonal, kind of legal, contractual kind of language you do in kind of pacts or contracts or treaties, right? This is like a treaty, like a contract, but it's a much more personal sort of thing, right? And kind of the particular use of those pronouns kind of indicates that sort of different character, right? I brought you to myself. Therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured possessions out of all people. What is the most important word in that verse? Maybe the shortest word in all, huh?
Yeah.
If is a big word, right? It's a small word, but it's big, right? It's a big word, right? It's maybe the most important word. And when we think about earlier covenants in the Bible, God makes a covenant with Noah after the flood. And what's the sign of that covenant? The rainbow, right? And he says, I'm not going to destroy the earth in the same way. And this is the sign of that covenant. With Abraham in chapter 17, there's a sign of the covenant, which is circumcision. So I don't know, if I were like Abraham, I'd be saying, wow, rainbows. Why not a rainbow? That's just a sign of the covenant. They're almost like unilateral things that God does. He doesn't really require anything of Noah. He doesn't really require anything of Abraham. He's like, he just kind of says, I'm going to do this for you. Now there is the sign, which is circumcision. But they're unconditional. This, though, seems to be conditional, right? If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession out of all people. So that's a big difference. The if. Logically, I guess you say there is a if not, what? He doesn't really spell it out, but just by the terms of the promise here, if you obey my voice, keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured possession. Logically, it's like, if we don't, then we won't be his treasured possession out of all people. What that means exactly is never spelled out. We probably should not think of, they're going to hell or something like that. There's not a whole lot of talk about heaven and hell in the Hebrew Bible. And it's not the case from the perspective of the Hebrew Bible that all non-Israelite peoples are just like damned or fated to be, consigned to, oblivion or something like that. They just don't have the same relationship. Now, that's, too bad for them, but it doesn't mean they're cursed or something like that. So the most we can say, and this is a lot, I guess, is that they would not be his treasured possession. what that means. But anything else about that language, if you obey my voice and keep, so if you're in this group, if you're assembled there at Sinai, and Moses says, here's what God says, if you obey my voice, keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. You got any questions for him? You ready to vote, thumbs up, thumbs down, or, well, I have a comment or a question. You have any questions here? Anything unclear about this?
Well, the language of a contract really, I don't think works, because these are commandments. And he is saying, you do this, or else there are consequences. And the Israelites don't have power. They don't bring anything to the table that really is negotiable. And so it's not really a treaty or a contract. It's more a command.
At least they're that strong. I mean, even the 10 Commandments, it's interesting. The 10 Commandments of Jewish tradition are not called mitzvot is the word for commandments. It's dibrot here, which means the 10 words, the 10 statements. Now, technically, they're not commandments coming up, though they do have that force of, it's literally, you will not commit adultery. And it's not really just a prediction. It does have the force of a command, like you're saying. So, but it is a little ambiguous, right? It's not just a, hey, I've got an idea. What do you think?
Well, the thing about false gods, if you don't believe in me, I'm assuming you believe in false gods, and I'll not only shoot you, but all generation of your children.
Yeah, right. There are going to be consequences that he does not spell out, but they're right there just off stage, right? Yeah. If you obey my voice and keep my covenants, you'll be my treasured possession. If I say, hey, as long as you do what I say in this class, you're gonna make an A. That sound good? You agree to that? You might want to know though, what am I gonna say? What am I gonna tell you to do? You're just trusting that I'm gonna be a reasonable teacher. I'll have reasonable demands in terms of tests and papers and that kind of thing. But you don't know for sure. You haven't seen the syllabus yet. So here he's saying, if you obey my voice, everything's gonna be good. Do you know what he's gonna say? Not yet. They're going to get that in a chapter. They're going to get the 10 Commandments. They're going to get all these other laws. But he's asking them to make this kind of like, it's like a step of faith here. I've got to, the people are being asked to kind of like assent to this without knowing what the fine print says. What are you going to require of me, God? We don't know yet. You might want to know, though. You might want it spelled out. Sorry, the glare on that clock. I'm trying to make sure I'm not going too long or too short. So we don't know, but it is much more of a personal kind of relationship in that it requires some trust or faith that this God is not some kind of crazy God who's going to make unreasonable demands, like kill your son, like Abraham or something like that. You shall be, let's focus on this next line. You shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. You shall be my treasured possession. That language, what does that do for you or make you wonder about? You'll be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Jesus? So what? So spell that out a little bit more. What do you mean, Jesus?
The Lord was giving a treasured possession to his son.
Okay. All right. Right. So there is something, looking forward into what, how this is going to be demonstrated, I guess, in the future. Yeah. You'll be my treasured possession out of all peoples. Implied in that, it seems to me, is out of all the people. So, out of all the Presbyterian churches that I've taught at before, Idlewild is the greatest. Does that make you guys feel special for me to, praise you that way? Now, what if I tell you I've only really given lessons at one Presbyterian church? So, it implies, for that to be praise, right? I must have spoken at hundreds, but you got, so when he says, out of all the, you'll be my treasured possession out of all the people. In order for that to be a really meaningful statement, it must be the case that God could have chosen other peoples, but they are special. Now here, we should think of the kind of kind of the norms of, forms of religious, belief in the ancient Near East. So you have lots of different peoples, cultures and religions, and we have our gods, but they tend to be very kind of tribal deities in the sense that I'm a Hittite, I have the Hittite gods. I'm a Amalekite, I've got Amalekite gods, and I believe in them and I trust them, and I worship them. And in one sense, what we have here is something that scholars call henotheism rather than monotheism. Monotheism is, I believe in one God, that only one God exists. Henotheism, which is comes from another word that means like one in Greek, it means I might believe that there are other gods over there among the Amalekites and the Hittites and the Lydians, for example, but my God and my tribe, we honor and adore and worship just this one God. You might recognize that your gods exist, but your gods don't have anything to do with me. The only time your gods and my gods really have anything to do with each other is when we go to war. And then if we beat you in the war, that means my God kind of like this, stronger than your God. But generally it's kind of everybody stays in their own jurisdiction, so to speak. When this God here says, you will be my treasured possession out of all the peoples, implied in that is that God, that Yahweh here, could pick other peoples, could have other peoples. Otherwise, if he's just a tribal deity where you're my people and I'm your God and I don't have any jurisdiction over those other people, then saying you'll be my treasured possession out of all the peoples, like me saying you're my favorite Presbyterian church I've ever taught at. I haven't taught at any other Presbyterian churches, right? So implied here is this God is making universal claims. I'm not just some tribal deity. I could have chosen other people, and I still yet may choose other people. Otherwise, you're my treasured possession out of all the people's languages, like kind of, that's nothing, right? But he's implying, so it seems like what we have here is we're moving towards, in the biblical perspective, from saying this God's not just like one God of many, but the God overall. We're not quite there. It seems like it entertains the possibility that the Israelites might believe in other gods. And if we go ahead to the 10 Commandments, which is the chapter ahead, right? What's the first of those commandments? Don't have other gods before me. You don't generally make laws against things people are not doing. So if the first commandment is don't worship these other gods, maybe sometimes people are worshiping other gods. So the idea of how these different gods kind of interact with each other is front and center. But you are my treasured possession out of all the peoples, or will be. And he follows that up in the next line, right? Indeed, the whole earth is mine. So all the cultures, all the peoples, even, the natural world. Remember what's he been doing in Egypt, kind of sending frogs and, storms and lice. So he's like saying, this whole world is mine. I'm not just some tribal deity. You shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. So some metaphorical language there. Kind of parallel, right? Priestly kingdom, holy nation. You kind of have two registers of language there, kind of like religious language, priestly, holy, modifying political language, a kingdom and a people or something like that. So I want to look at the adjectives first and see what this says about the nature of Israelite identity. He says, you will be for me a priestly kingdom. He does not say you will be a kingdom of priests, though there will be priests. And later in this book, it's going to talk about what the priests are, what they're going to do, what they're going to wear, what kind of environment they're going to do their priestly duties in. There are priests, but he's not saying you're all going to be priests. It's an adjective, a priestly kingdom. So you will be a kingdom that has the quality of, or some of the qualities of priests, right? So priests, what is the function of a priest? You might think of like priests or ministers and, Christian or non-Christian, modern or ancient settings, but what are some of the functions that priests fulfill?
Mediation.
You got there in one step, right? And so how do they mediate?
Between God and God and humanity.
from God and humanity. You know,
They interpret, they expound for human.
yeah, they kind of like take God's words, messages, and kind of like interpret them, process them, deliver them for the people. That's right, yeah. And then what do they do in the other direction? So
They sort of explain people to God.
make sacrifices, yeah, take the prayers of the people and kind of bring them up to God. But you're exactly, I mean, like I said, you got there in one, right? They're like mediators. And in fact, in Latin, the word for, I mean, not that etymology is everything, but in Latin, the word for priest is pontifex, which means bridge maker. So it's like a bridge, you know, which links, you know, two different places, right? So like a mediator. Right, so they're going to be a priestly kingdom, which means they're going to have the quality of kind of a mediator, right? Now, and you kind of like already said this, but you know, so a mediator stands between two different parties, right? All right, if Israel is going to be priestly, going to be kind of a mediator, well, implicit in that is that they're between two different parties. So in this metaphor, then, who is Israel standing between? What are the two different parties?
All the other nations and God.
You are like on fire. Exactly, right, yeah. Yeah, so between God and everybody else, right? And how then are they to perform this mediating function that is at the core of their identity, to stand between God and everybody else who's not Israel? Well, then that is, I think, kind of implied in the next phrase that's kind of parallel, a holy nation. They're to be holy. Holiness has the sense of being set apart, distinctive, not like everybody else, right? And so, again, this sort of, when you think about it, it's kind of self-evident. If you are not distinctive, set apart, different from everybody else, you are, by definition, not distinctive. You are like everybody else. And if you are like everybody else, you just kind of merge into everybody else, and you can't do what? You can't stand between God and everybody else if you are everybody else, right? That makes sense? And so holiness has a lot of different dimensions, but it means being distinctive. The fine print there is not spelled out, though. We said, okay, how or in what respect are we, Israel, to be different from everybody else? That is the question, the overarching question that will occupy much of the rest of the Bible, which is, okay, you know, are we supposed to be 100% different from everybody else, just a little different from everybody else, or in what ways are we to be different from everybody else? And this becomes an internal Jewish debate up to the present day, really. I mean, think about whether generally speaking or specifically related to Jewish people, what are some things that set cultures apart from one another? You know, the culture that you are part of, the culture that you're part of, what are some of the things that kind of like, you know, kind of indicate different, you know, what are the differences between cultures? Again, these are general sorts of things. We talk about specifics with Israel, but what are the kind of things that separate one culture from another? Did you say language?
Beliefs.
Belief, yeah, so religious kind of things?
No, I was saying the way they worship.
Oh, yeah, so the way to worship is a big, I mean, a cult and culture are, you know, are related that way. Yeah, so religious beliefs, you know, language, you know, different kind of languages people speak. Race, yeah, I mean, so what you look like, which is related to like who you're, you know, procreating with, right? So who you marry, right? Who you know, what the tribe means, yeah.
Laws, politics.
That's right, kind of legal kind of culture. We're going to get that,
What you eat.
what you eat and what you don't eat, right? Yeah. So yeah, all these sorts, you know, kind of the holy days you celebrate or don't. Yeah. So think about that with all the things that kind of set Jews apart from non-Jews. You know, I mean, a certain kind of religion, right? Culture, and it's not like all Jews are the same on this, right? I mean, we have lots of debate within Judaism. That's part of my point. It's like, well, do we have to keep kosher? A lot of Jews keep kosher. A lot of Jews don't keep kosher, right? Or this, you know, worshiping on the, you know, how you maintain it, how you celebrate the Sabbath, right? Whether you intermarry, or don't intermarry. So a lot of these things, do we have to be like politically, like kind of in our political forms, very distinctive? Can we have a monarchy, or not? Do we need to live in Israel or not? So these are things that, like I said, continually are debated within Judaism as well about how permeable are those borders? How distinctive do we have to be? It's not spelled out here, but if they're not in some way distinctive, then they're just like everybody else. They can't maintain their kind of mediating function, right? So, like I said, there's a lot in just those very few verses that that reflect some of the basic aspects of what it means to be God's people. We've got to be thinking about this. What does it mean to be holy? How are we going to set ourselves apart? Part of it, of course, is kind of moral holiness, which is going to be spelled out very concisely, right, in the next chapter, chapter 20, which is where we get the 10 Commandments, which we're just going to look at very, very briefly. But that is again, they're commandments, so they're not called commandments. They're the 10 statements, and there's some debate within the Jewish philosophical tradition. Maimonides and others, for example, is like when you look at those first couple commandments, you shall not worship other gods. I am the Lord, your God. Can you command belief? This is a debate within Judaism, right? Can you command someone, don't believe in God, or believe in God? And some say, you can't command that. I can't command you to like chocolate pudding, right? If you don't like it, either you like it or you don't like it, Now I can kind of habituate you to it, I guess. So it's not exactly a perfect analogy, but I can't say, believe, you will like this, So they are, but they definitely have the force of command, don't murder, don't commit adultery. These are not suggestions. Don't bear false witness. Don't covet your neighbor's house. Now, this is a nice, concise moral code that most people, with some exceptions, would endorse as, these are pretty good ideas. These are kind of way, you need this for kind of a stable society. Though as a law code, really it would not be adequate. Of course, we could always talk about, well, what does it mean to honor your father and mother? Again, kind of like getting into the fine print, what does coveting look like? How do you enforce these sorts of things, right? I'm kind of a small government kind of guy. I would like 10 laws, probably all broke laws on the way over here, not even being aware of it. So, there's something very attractive about having 10 laws. But this would not, but if we just said, let's scrap our legal code and put in the 10 Commandments, it wouldn't work, if only because, what does it not have? Thou shalt not kill. Has no penalties, right? So in kind of technical language, these laws are apodictic, which means absolute. They are just flat prohibitions. Most of them are prohibitions. Some of them are affirmative commands. Honor your father and mother, but most of them are don't kill, don't steal, don't, they're prohibitions. So apodictic means just absolute statements, kind of like that. And they do not have, as you say, well, what if somebody does kill? What if somebody does commit adultery, right? For that, we have to look in Exodus 21, 22, 23, which is where we get, it's sometimes called the Book of the Covenant or the Covenant Code. This is where we get lots of specific laws. Number one, we have that. Now, if we look at all of Torah, all of the Pentateuch, according to Jewish tradition, trivia question, somebody at home or somebody here probably knows, how many laws are there? What number in all of the Pentateuch? Anybody know? 613.
Wow.
613. So there are 365 prohibitions and 258 positive commands, according to Jewish tradition. And they start here, right? This is called the Covenant Code, or the Book of the Covenant. And these have what the Ten Commandments don't have, which is, well, what if somebody does kill somebody? So this is more like kind of a modern legal code, I guess you could say, where it's like, if someone through their negligence, well, kills your ox, what then? You gotta replace, if somebody builds a house, the ark, and it falls down and kills somebody, what happened? We kill, if you curse your mother and father, often what's the penalty in a lot of these laws? I don't know if you probably haven't read through them much recently, but
Yeah.
a lot of them is death. That's right. It's kind of a simplified code. Now, a lot of them are very similar. When I say law code, ancient law code, does anybody know of any other ancient law codes? There's probably one you think of. The Code of Hammurabi. A lot of these are very, very similar. A lot of them are identical because we're in the same region, same kind of culture, with a lot of the same kind of concerns. There's a lot of stuff here about oxen, a lot of stuff here about slaves. It doesn't endorse slavery. It doesn't condemn slavery. It just kind of takes it as a given, as most cultures in all of human history have until like a couple hundred years ago. And it just kind of takes it as a given and regulates it, But so this is a slave-holding culture. It's an agricultural, kind of rural kind of culture. There's a lot of rules about oxen, a lot about cows, right? So very similar to the Code of Hammurabi. And there's often it's death. You're right, but is there like a principle that seems to govern a lot of the penalties that are to be meted out for different crimes? There's one kind of general principle. You'll know exactly, if you don't already know it, you'll know it exactly when I say it. I mean, they're not just totally random, right? Often you commit some crime or sin. How do you determine what's an appropriate penalty? Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. If you look in chapter 21, verse 22, this is also in the Code of Hammurabi. It's called the Lex Talionis, or the Law of Retaliation. Chapter 21, verse 22, it's spelled out verse 23. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, strike for strike. Eye for an eye is much shorter. So, that's the kind of shorthand for that. Now that we're familiar with that principle, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. A lot of people feel like it seems like harsh, right? Now, maybe fair, maybe equitable, maybe just, but a lot of people kind of cringe probably when you think of an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, a little vengeful or something like that. And the last thing I want to do here is put this in context and help us to understand it, not to kind of like say, hey, let's kind of like do this ourselves, but to kind of put it in some context. This is, so an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. We should not probably shouldn't think of this as a law code like what we have today, where we have laws on the books and now everybody kind of knows what they are. This is not like a criminal code. There is not some big central government in ancient Israel laying out, here's what the laws are, and you break a law, then I'm going to take you, you're going to get arrested, you're going to be tried. This is more like kind of a civil code. I'm not a lawyer, so my language is probably going to be imprecise in some of these things. But this is kind of a description of how things work on the ground. Things happen, through negligence, I do something and I kill your oxen, or we get into a fight and I, knock your tooth out or something like that. Now, we get into a fight and I knock your tooth out. What do you want to, what will make things right? You might want to, knocking my tooth out might make you feel good, like kind of emotionally, but will knocking my tooth out really help you? What should be done if we get into a fight and I knock your tooth out? What is the appropriate kind of remedy for that situation? I should pay your dental bill. That's right. Or if I do something through my recklessness, I kill your oxen. You can kill my oxen, but that's not going to bring your oxen back. I need to compensate you for your lost oxen, right? So in the absence of like an elaborate court system where you can like kind of bring a civil suit, and we should think of these as like kind of like torts, I guess you think. the community has a sense of what's the appropriate remedy. I kill your oxen, I need to pay for that oxen. I need to kind of like, there aren't a lot of good dentists in ancient Israel, so I probably can't fix your, but I should compensate you for that. Now, what's the appropriate compensation for knocking your tooth out? Is it $10 million? That's excessive, right? But like, a 20, that's not enough for knocking your tooth out.
Yeah, but then you get into the fact that somebody's got all this money and they feel like they can do anything they want to anybody else because they've got lots of money and are not accountable.
Okay, all right. So in this situation, so if I knock your tooth out, you're coming back at me, right? I mean, but what's the human tendency? I'm going to knock your tooth out. You're just going to knock my tooth out. Probably what you're going to do is probably more extreme than knocking my tooth out, right? You're probably going to like hit me with a baseball bat. And then I'm not going to just hit you with a baseball bat. I'm going to pull out, what tends to happen? It escalates, right? I call your mother something and you punch me and then it tends to escalate, right? And so counterintuitively, I guess you could say, the purpose of the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, is not to encourage this kind of Hatfield and McCoy back and forth where it's going out of control. It's actually to limit it. That is to say, revenge or kind of like some kind of penalty is appropriate. It's not out of bounds to say that someone should like bear some kind of penalty for doing something like that, but there should be a limit. Now, coming back to the situation you said, so you got a lot of people with a lot of money, but most people aren't going to like have tons of money, I guess. So I knock your tooth out. The appropriate thing, the community kind of consensus is that there's a certain amount of money that would kind of make this right? Now what happens, and there's a certain value that an ox has, and that I should pay that to you, I should pay that to you. Now what happens if I don't have that money? I can't afford to pay you whatever we've determined is an appropriate compensation for knocking your tooth out. That's where the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, it's not like people are going around to like punching people's, gouging people's eyes out. But the idea is if I've knocked your tooth out and I can't afford to compensate you, then you actually are permitted in the community, in the community's eyes, that you can come after me and knock my tooth out, or you can come after me and kill my. Now, if I know that you can come after me and the community's not going to do anything to stop you from like causing damage to me, that gives me a real incentive to do what? Talk to my uncle or some. I'm getting that money from somebody to pay you back, because otherwise I know that you're coming after me and the community is going to say, we're totally fine with that. So the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, in this kind of a setting, in the absence of a big kind of like government, kind of like judicial system that kind of like sorts all this stuff out, we're doing it one-on-one here, It actually means to limit that sort of retaliation. Retaliation and seeking damages, totally appropriate, but only up to a point, right? And so it seems weird, but it's kind of understandable. And one kind of modern analogy, and it's not really even an analogy, but here we're about to end. The thing that it reminds me of is how accidental death and dismemberment policies work. Most of us don't have any kind of like occasion to kind of look at the fine print of maybe this is included in an employment kind of like fringe benefits you have, or sometimes even with like, like airline tickets, but there are actual dollar amount values placed on parts of your body. For example, so I'm looking at an accidental death and dismemberment policy for that. So if I am, so it's attached to my employment. So if in the course of doing my job, I lose both of my hands, there's a dollar amount. So let's say I make $100,000 a year, I don't, but these are given in percentages. So if I lose both of my hands, I get $100,000. So I guess, 50,000 right here. If you lose both your feet, you get 100% of your salary. What do you think an arm is worth? If I lose my arm, it's worth 75% of my salary. Speech or hearing is 66 2/3%, of my salary.
What if you don't work?
What if you work? Yeah, I don't know. All toes on the same foot, 12.5%. So toes are cheap. Toes are easy to come by. My favorite is 1 foot and entire sight of 1 eye. Like it's on one line. That's worth 100%. So in one way, the idea of like putting like a dollar amount value on body parts or things like that is kind of weird and primitive, but it's apparently not. So anyway, so that I just want to, that's kind of a familiar kind of text, and I wanted to kind of like make it seem even weirder, but in some ways more familiar. That we don't exactly operate our legal system on this kind of principle, but it's not entirely absent either. All right, so it's 22.
Where were you reading
Right.
that, the foot thing?
Oh, this is the act. This is the fine print of an accidental death and dismemberment policy. So
Is that the road, is that it?
this one actually I couldn't find it. This is from McGill University, which is Montreal. So I think lots of.
Yeah.
I think Rose has something similar, but I wasn't able to find it on the website. So, but it spells it out. Hearing in one ear, hearing's only worth $16,000 a year. But there can be a big difference between losing your leg here and losing your leg right below the knee. So anyway, all right, good.
Thank you so much. My dad lost his, left leg below the knee in World War II.
In World War II?
So he had an artificial leg and
So we got, this bill.
I don't know, yeah, I'm sure he got some